Those of you who know our business know that Catherine is the brains, and I'm not the beauty, that's for sure. But I would like to go through this presentation the best that I can. Details about it, and certainly the intellectual heavy-duty lifting, Catherine, I'm sure, would be happy to get involved with. And it was interesting now, the final presentation before lunch, Morris obviously talked about the details of tendering and council's roles in that and your obligations. Tony and Lee spoke about the outcomes in contracts for residents and what they look for as contractors, and that's really interesting, particularly about the Central Coast. And then Scott, that was terrific from a contractor point of view, looking at the complexities. We all assume that bigger is better, but to have that sweet spot analogy, and also I think you're right, Scott, the more choice that are given to residents, which seems to be a societal thing, makes it more complicated in tendering. And as Gail said, how you build a specification and search for the bid is the complicated part. But so today I wasn't going to cover anything to do with the developing the bid and the actual contract itself. I was going to talk about the next big challenge, and that is after the contract has been executed. But as has been said in previous speakers, the collection, recycling and organics processing and haulage, they're massive contracts for council. They're often the largest that a council will execute. Long term, there's significant resources and costs involved. Even, as Tony said, at least 5 years, 10 years for a collection contract, up to 15 years for the infrastructure contracts. And importantly, it's a reflection of the council to the community. So the contractor becomes the interface between the community and the council, and you get a good contractor and the council looks good. If there's problems, of course, that affects that image of the council. Usually it follows a competitive tender process. Of course, Morris outlined council's obligations in New South Wales, and it's similar in other states and jurisdictions, I'm sure. And these contracts are essential to supporting the waste industry, and their proper administration is important for all stakeholders. The interesting thing I think about contracts, it's where strategy meets practice. So the contracts see when the council develops a strategy, which hopefully most of you do, once that the rubber hits the road is where the contract is involved. Just briefly to put to context what I wanted to talk about, the waste contract life cycle here, and the other guys have spoken about most of the steps in this cycle. The strategic planning side of it is happening more and more, and that's great. Councils are understanding their obligations, and the EPA have actually required a lot of strategic planning for local government in New South Wales. The needs identification, I mean, as Scott was saying, one of the biggest problems we have is honing down the options. Gail pointed out that oftentimes our specifications are very complex and there's a lot of options. Every time we walk into a council, we try as hard as we can to limit the options. Some of those need to be market tested, so if the council doesn't have a clear idea of the cost benefit of an option, sure enough, it's fair enough to market test that, but the best you can do is to try and narrow down those options. So in that needs identification, which flows out of the strategic planning, that's critical. The call for tenders now, obviously most of it's electronic. It's a system where you get cut off at a certain time. We've seen tenders as late as last year or the year before that missed out, like $1 million tenders that missed out by 10 minutes. I mean, you really have to be aware of how precise that system is now and the way it works from a council point of view. The tender evaluation, look, this hasn't been talked about today. It's a whole talk in itself. It's really interesting. We've found over the years, we do about 10 to 20 contracts a year, which we've done for about 20 years. So, we all metropolitan Australia and New Zealand, we see a lot of different approaches. But certainly tender evaluation is the one where it's critical to have the right people in the room at the right time, and oftentimes it doesn't happen. Councils will grab a finance manager who's busy and overstressed, does not read the document, comes to the meeting, doesn't have the time, and will follow the voting pattern of other people. And when that happens on these contracts, which happens a lot, it ends up in a high-risk result. So the evaluation process is a high-risk area. It's one that is improving. Probity processes are playing their role, and so the tender evaluation is a critical component as well. Awarding the contract, Morris spoke about the importance of execution and signing and awarding the contract in the right way. But really, the non-urgent, important thing is contract management. And it's the one we wanted to focus on today, and it's the one that we as consultants who work in the industry are finding is the big Achilles heel, because the rest of it people are getting up to speed about, but until contract management gets what it deserves, it's really going to lead into high risks for the following contracts. So what is the contract management phase? Well, it's the longest period in the whole life cycle that I showed earlier. It involves the establishment of the contract, the bedding down of the relationship, the administration, establishing the roles and responsibilities between the parties, managing the relationships. And you'll hear me mention that word relationship a lot, because ultimately the relationship between the contractor and the council is the critical component. I mean, a good contract you really shouldn't have to revert to too much if the relationship's strong and the performance is there. The contract management phase is about managing performance. It's about those regular meetings, keeping everyone on the same page. We've had legal advice over the years that if it's not started out as a regular meeting pattern, you can't come back 3 years later and say, look, you've been doing a bad job, because you don't have a strong legal base to stand on if that happens. Negotiating any variations on the way, it's a narrow opportunity to do that, but if it's needed along the way, a contract management phase should be able to allow for that. Management of disputes, of course. Ethical business conduct in that contract management phase manages that. And then the important one is contract completion, so you're setting it up for the next phase around. So why is it important? Well, contract management is that ongoing relationship. It's the long term and the significant cost that matters. Many responsibilities need to be monitored to ensure the community are receiving those services. I mean, the contractor will say in their bid that they'll do certain things, but the community expectations, as I think Tony was pointing out, the community expectations are the contractor will do the job that they're entitled to do, and they're getting the results the community are paying for. And I think it's important as well to ensure the administration of the contract is in accordance with the specification and conditions. I mean, we write the specification. Sometimes it's a balance between prescription and performance. I mean, it's better to try and go towards performance, but oftentimes you do need prescription. And I hear what you're saying, Tony, about start times. Every time we go to a council, you know, they're very specific about start times for their reasons. So if you can bring those things back into performance approaches, I think you get a better result for everybody. For example, in terms of contract management performance, that all services are being delivered properly, that buildings and other infrastructure are complying not only with planning requirements, but also in accordance with the contract specification, that rise and fall and other claims are being accurately verified. I mean, over the years, certainly rise and fall claims is another big one that's a difficult one for councils to keep onto. But again, you've got to start from the word go and stay on that. And that risks to council are monitored and appropriately managed. So the benefits of good contract management, you've got a good probity process, you've got legislative and audit compliance, risk management, value for money is being achieved, OH&S is being addressed, council and community objectives are being addressed, and contractor relationship. I mean, it all seems pretty basic stuff, but what happens many times is once the contract is signed, council officers change, situations change, the manual gets put away, and the contractor is left a lot of times to their own devices. And when that happens, as Tony said earlier, the contractor will perform what they have to do, but in terms of elevating performance and getting a better outcome, you need to keep an eye on it. And on the relationship side, which I had down there as the last point, the contractor relationship. The means of communication. When those first meetings start with contractors, the way that you sit down and engage with the contractor, the face-to-face, the daily face-to-face or weekly meetings, monthly meetings, the email contact, phone contact, the written correspondence. I mean, now there's live web tracking of vehicles, councils have live access to information and live complaints tracking. Now, all of those things should be followed in a good contract management phase. It should be a whole range of elements on communication that keep the relationship strong, and it's critical that structured meetings be used. So I've pointed out there with contract management how important it is, and now what we see is the problem. We do see procurement processes, as I said earlier, have improved. We see councils are beginning to apply and try and apply value for money. Every contract we've been involved in the last 5 or 10 years, we have a separation of non-price and price considerations. Price is not looked at until the non-price elements are worked out. Typically in a collection contract, the non-price elements sit around 30 to 50% and the price is around 50%. So in most cases, councils support that approach, and it is amazing how it gets the right result. You get the best value for money if you don't look at the price first, because otherwise it becomes a justification process. So councils are beginning to apply that value for money. Probity is well understood. In our roles, certainly, councils sometimes have internal probity officers, and oftentimes on the bigger ones, an external probity advisor, which is great because those guys, if they understand local government, they keep the process rolling and everyone's covered for risk. Market knowledge is improving. This is another thing. Local government has been drawn into understanding the market. Now, local government, who we mainly work with local government, are community-minded people. They're not necessarily there to make the big bucks, but they're community-minded. So it's been a difficult thing for them to understand how economic principles work, because it's not at the top of their mind. So bringing that knowledge about market to understand with councils is a really important part of that. Councils are expected to be more business-like, and it's a good thing to understand economic principles. Councils are now allowing more time. Some councils are. I mean, this week is not a good example, but you know, the amount of time councils need to allow by legislation in New South Wales, it's 3 weeks for a tender process. Now, that's bare minimum. So they really need to have a look at the whole cycle I was talking about earlier and really allow plenty of time, because you'll get a better bid. You'll get a much better bid allowing time. And when Scott was talking earlier about, 5, 6 councils running together on a bid process, I mean, you should be allowing months, if not years, for people to get their information together to put a proper bid on that. Otherwise, you will not get many companies interested. And the problem is, once contracts are signed, there's an inconsistent contract management and performance monitoring, which leaves the parties little or no time, little or no contract management results, from the contractor's perspective, uncertainty, less accountability, lack of clear communication, and then less confidence in the next contract. And for council, they can't track the contractor's performance. There's a risk to the relationship, exposed to other risks, poor contract performance, poor value for money, etc. So what's happening now? Well, certainly in the space we're working in, and most other consultants who work in this space with councils, it's about performance measurement and monitoring for waste contracts. And this is, in our situation, drafted into conditions of contract, so the councils can manage performance, service levels, auditing, key performance indicators, and a failure to satisfy these key performance indicators. In terms of the solution, well, we spoke about this 3 years ago at this conference regarding contract management, and we said then, and we say again, improved contract management is what's needed. And I suppose our deliberations in the last 12 months, we've concluded that some sort of systematic approach is needed to assist councils to manage contracts better. And it's not a system that's needed to take more time, it's a system that needs to make it simpler. So we concluded that system needs to be easy to use and assist parties to conform with their obligations. We've been developing contract management documents, but they remain a document which the councils then have to take away and apply, and it's still not being effectively done. So we realised a better system was needed, and so we've been working through a state government grant. We've been working on the development of an online contract management system. This contract management system developed specifically for waste management contracts. It's designed mainly for local government waste contracts, so you can do this off the shelf. I would encourage you to look at this whole system of contract management using software, because that's, we think, is what is needed. So, but we personally have, Catherine and I certainly have been looking at a cloud-based, purpose-built software system. We did receive a grant for this, and we're currently trialling it in New South Wales. So we're trialling it with Canada Bay City Council, and their contractor is Suez. We're seeking feedback from these guys and from the council, and we hope to conclude it later in the year. Just to give you a quick flavour of what it's about, it's a purpose-built system, so logins are created for the council representatives and the contractor. It's a secure system. All the KPIs and the information from the contract gets dropped into the system, and then both councils, both parties have different administrative views and can log on. The contract details are all recorded about commencement, expiry, extensions, etc. And then the responsibilities for the contract are identified and assigned to the appropriate council or contract representative, so everyone knows who's supposed to be doing what and who's responsible for what performance measures. Action schedules are then set up for each contract clause, so the clauses are taken out of the contract and put in. If no action's taken, for example, after 7 days, it escalates up the chain, so the manager finds out that the meeting hasn't been held, and there's some sort of internal accountability. And the required information is not provided, it'll be escalated, as I mentioned. So actions can be organised into categories. This one relates to mobile garbage bins, and you can see anything to do with bins has its own category. Look, it's a system that just tries to automate what I said earlier, that it's a contract management system that just tries to automate what councils and the contractors we think need to be done. And we've spoken to contractors as well as councils about this whole concept. The contractors seem to want it as much as the councils, because the contractors, it's higher risk for them if they're not being monitored properly. That's just a record system on terms of the way the communication heads, and this is an editing system. So there's bits and pieces there, but at the end of the day, what the system should do is develop a secure, dedicated system that'll assist both the contractor and the councils. It'll generate correspondence, templates, performance monitoring tools. It'll allow for better record keeping. It'll ensure the risks are mitigated, and it'll be customised for each council. So I know that seems to me like a bit of a sales plug, but we got a grant to try this out. We're not at a commercial stage. We think it's a tool that should help the industry. How far we go with it, we're not sure, but certainly we think it might help in that important contract management stage. So thank you, Gail.